let's drop back for a second because some of our listeners and viewers won't ever have encountered John Boyd. And we want to make sure that not only we don't inadvertently teach them bad Boyd, because you wouldn't like that, but also that they get from the get-go, they get a good general overview of the crux of Boyd in the OODA framework. Can you talk about that slow, like you're talking to someone with a beginner's mind?
We'll skip the biography of Boyd because that's something that definitely distracts from his work. But basically, one question that we could posit is, how do we win in a world that's moving faster than we can process it? Or how do we sense within reality what is reality to us? How do we operate in it when our perceptions are incomplete, when there is no such thing as certainty, and that everything will always be subject to the second law of thermodynamics, entropy? That we have to constantly revise and update our cognitive understanding of what it is that we're interacting with continuously on what Wood called the whirl of reorientation, is the name for the Substack. And he told us that there's no way out of that, which is where the podcast title comes from.
So you can either do it well or do it shitty, and people who don't do it well are unsuccessful.
And everybody's doing it, and that's the thing. So this is another thing where people really fail with Boyd. They think, well, I'm going to use Boyd here, but I won't use Boyd there. And Boyd, like Hayek and Mises, was discovering and describing. He wasn't inventing or designing. He was describing what actually happens in reality. So when you look at things like OODA Loop Sketch and you go through his briefings or whatever, he's describing what we're all doing inherently, right? Successful people inherently understand what Boyd is describing and what he discovered and what he describes. When our business, our life's work, is showing people that when you understand it, your results are going to be geometric, because more than likely your competitors will not take the effort to
So what's the difference, for example, then between observation and orientation? Just the first two. O and O.
If you look at the OODA loop as how an agent interacts with its environment, a living system, how it interacts with the external world, you'll start to see that you need to put a boundary around the agent to separate it from the external world, and it scales. There are no boundaries between me and the external world other than my skin, but that's not my real boundary. So observation and action are the only two I call them features, if you will, that come into contact with the external world, right? So modern neuroscience, what we're learning now is that we are creating this perception off a controlled hallucination. There's a model called orientation. Orientation is a world model. It's not a result. So it is it's part of a process. We'll call it that. But think of it as a generative learning model of what we believe is on the external world. And we being an agent, a living cell, a neuron, a team, an organization, a society, a universe, right?
Yeah, it's fractal.
And from a cognitive science standpoint, that's just what we're doing. We're creating models or representations of what we take to be some phenomenon in the world around us. And we're constantly acting relative to that. We can't avoid it, but we can do it poorly or better. Is that?
Well, we can understand it or not understand it.
We're all doing it poorly.
We're all doing it poorly or well. It comes down to understanding what his real kernel of truth, his real starting point, was destruction and creation. And destruction and creation is a very simple, depending on the version that you get, it's 8 to 11 pages, depending on how the print was. It's not very long. It's really the only thing that he ever published outside of the military, of the work that he did in the military. It's the only thing that he ever published, with the exception of briefings that exist. And destruction and creation, really the big picture takeaway is that you can't determine the character or nature of a system within itself. And the more that you try to do that, it's going to lead to more disorder and more confusion.
And this is very much in keeping with the Hayekian conclusion
no question.
Let's build on that. So orientation is a repository for our genetics, our DNA, our culture, so things like languages and how we grew up, and our previous experience. And we go back 15, 20 minutes in this episode, and I brought up the Chicago School and Moose is learning about Hayek and Mises. My orientation about economics is built off of Keynesian approach, right? whereas Moose is probably built off a more Hayekian approach. Well, that orientation changes how we look at the world, right? So if you look at folks that have a different education or maybe no education in economics, they're going to look at the world through a different lens, right? That's that experience, that outer layer of the orientation. For culture, language matters. How we're brought up in our family, the languages that we learn, the symbols that we learn, and of course genetics. Genetics drives a lot of things. So there's 3 levels that are changing on different time scales, but they interact quite a bit. So that's that world model that John Boyd created, and that's what he called orientation. That's driving everything for us.
Everything.
So how much sleep I got last night, what I ate for lunch is determining who I am right now. Just as what I learned 20 years ago in school or 30 years ago in school, or what I did in my previous life. I mean, before I started doing this, not what I was doing as an ancient alien or anything like that. But you get my point. It's all these things matter. So that orientation is everything. He just called it orientation. It's again a process or part of a process. It's not a result.
So if there's a process, according to Boyd, let's say I've got a lot of information coming in, okay, through my observational faculties, whatever that is. It could be in a cockpit, it could be on a battlefield, it could be in a business setting. I could have a specific role within an organization and not another role in an organization, but I'm getting in all of this information. Is some of that information signal and some of that information noise, and how do I know the difference?
Orientation would help you filter that out.
So let me bring this up. On that, there's a saying that we use, and that is we only see what we expect to see, right? So our orientation determines what we're going to see from the external world. So we get into something known as inattentional blindness. There's been a lot of studies on this that suggest that roughly 83% of a population of a small group or large group will see things one way, while the 17% will see weak signals in the environment. They'll actually see something that others don't see. And that's just, I don't want everybody to think that there's 17% of the population that sees things differently. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying in a group, when you're experiencing a thing, some people are going to see things that are different. Well, imagine that 17% sees something that the others don't see. 83% are saying, hey, you that is seeing this weak signal, you're wrong because 80% of us see it this way. So you're in the minority, you're wrong. Well, that's a weak signal you just suppressed, right? So these are things that are known to cognitive scientists that are studying how humans behave in the world. That is part of our orientation. It's part of our genetic heritage, right? We are predisposed to see things differently just from genetics, and as well as culture, as well as our experience. So what we need to do is we use the OODA loop, the observe, orient, decide, act loop, to identify some methods that can leverage the cognitive diversity of a group. How do we get to that 17% that see things differently, right? What do we need to do? Well, we come up with things like red teaming, complex facilitation techniques. We create an environment, what is known as psychological safety. People talk about that quite a bit. That's an action by a leader within a construct, if you will, a local construct that allows you and I to be our full selves when we're at work. I can say something and say, hey, I'm seeing this. Are you guys seeing that? And feel comfortable about it. But we don't create those environments right now. We suppress that information. We look to folks that see things differently, and maybe people on the spectrum, maybe people that are neurodiverse, and go, that's just weird. We just don't want to deal with that. So what do we need to do? We need to understand.
It's a tendency for people in say corporate environments to overlook these minority reports or different ways of looking at things, the neurodivergence, if you like.
Yeah. So we want to find a way to leverage those weak signals in an organization, because that's where novelty is. That they're seeing something in the outside world, just the environment, that the rest don't see, right? So, you go to meetings, and what do people do in meetings? They talk about the things they know, right? And something else happens in a meeting, especially in the Pentagon. People like to talk about things that they know because that makes them feel smarter and it gets them a promotion, right? Nobody talks about the things that nobody knows. And again, that's at 17%. And I'm using that number, it's just a number that came out of some research several years ago. We don't know the actual number, but I'll give you an example. Your listeners may have seen a scene where some kids are dribbling a basketball in white t-shirts, and the name of the game is to count the number of times the kids dribble the basketball, right? And they do that. So what you did is you just primed them to look for the basketball going up and down. But what actually happens is a gorilla walks behind them in the background that nobody sees, right? So that's what is known as inattentional blindness. Another example is for those of you who ride motorcycles, you're predisposed to be looking for motorcycles on the highway because you're used to doing that. Whereas somebody who doesn't ride a motorcycle isn't going to be looking for a motorcycle. And that's what makes driving a motorcycle somewhat dangerous, right? So again, it's an experience thing, right? I have experience riding a motorcycle, therefore I will be on the lookout for people that are on motorcycles.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Before we move on from Boyd, though, I want to make sure that you feel like you guys have paved the way with Boyd in terms of giving people a basic understanding about the process. Is there anything about decision or action, the D and A part of the OODA framework, that you want to emphasize?
Well, let me ask. So I would think that many people that listen to you have a pretty good grounding in Mises and praxeology.
I would think so. I'd say a good percentage of them do.
So if you get human action and you read like the first part, actually I threw it in the chat here, one of the articles that I wrote on the Substack called "My Continuing Inquiry into John Boyd in Austrian Economics." I mean, really, what Mises is describing is the OODA loop sketch perfectly, right? So when he's thinking of that, man envisions his uneasiness. For example, I'm wearing a sweater today. Why? It's nasty outside here in Manhattan, right? So I want to stay warm. I went outside. I put on a raincoat, right? I'm constantly envisioning that uneasiness I would feel of being wet or being cold or whatever, and then I purposefully act to make that change. And if I get too hot, then I imagine being cool, and I envision, I could feel the uneasiness, and I could go through that whole process that he describes. That's just OODA loop sketch. It's the same. It's the same description of OODA loop sketch from the same vantage point. And where I connected with originally Hunter Hastings and I co-authored 2 papers for the Mises Institute's Austrian Economics Research Conference was around that idea. It was that what Mises is describing and Boyd is describing is the same. It's the same thing. Well, on one hand, it's orientation. On one hand, it's the praxeological axiom. So one of the things, if you look at that article, I do break down a lot of the very some of the fundamental Misesian concepts of action, and then show that those things emerge from my orientation. That emerges from my cognitive software and how I interact with reality and how I act within the world. One of the other books that I used quite a bit in the research was The Ultimate Foundation of Economic Science. And the opening line is Heraclitus saying that all things are in a state of flux. And Mises actually writes it in the Greek, the pantarei. All things are in a state of constant flux that's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. It's always changing. It's always becoming. So ties right into what Boyd is telling us in Destruction and Creation, that because of that, and he defines that as entropy, uncertainty, and incompleteness. That's exactly why we have to constantly reorient, and do our best to improve our understanding of what it is that we're interacting with in order to improve our capacity for free and independent action. To him, that's the ultimate goal, is that we're trying to improve our capacity for free and independent action.
There's a couple of components I'll add to this, and that is within the OODA loop, it leads to a deeper understanding of how we actively create our reality or our perception of the external world. So there's something known as active inference. So we run the simulation within an agent, if you will. That is in conjunction with predictive processing, our predictions about what's on the outside. We want to close the gap between a mismatch or what is known as surprise. So the OODA loop is really rich with these connections to modern neuroscience, what's being discovered today and talked about, because Boyd was on the same path 30 years ago, right? And he saw these things from different disciplines and said, this is how an agent interacts with its environment. And the language he had back then isn't what we have today, right? We don't, implicit guidance to control, feedback loops, negative feedback loops, they did exist back then, but today that's known as perception or a flow state or intuition, right? So there are strong connections to where AI is going, because this next generation of AI wants to follow natural intelligence, and who better to follow than humans, right?
you guys, come back to the word cognitive, which is really more in the head, right? But you just mentioned intuition. And I wondered if the affective, like the emotional centers, and the visceral, or maybe intuitive, or the action oriented, that is the sort of bypasses the cognitive sometimes. Have you found that in these corporate contexts that the emotional, the relational,
Mhm.
the intuitive, that these other modalities of dealing with information, or because I think we could argue that you want it to be mostly cognitive, right? But there are other modalities. People have really good intuitions about things, and sometimes
Mhm.
they're hard to articulate. How do you reckon with those things in the framework?
We do want system one thinking, and I think you're familiar with that. And then there's like level one, level zero cognition and our cognitive approaches as well. So that system one thinking is you want to burn that into, they used to call it muscle memory. It's just a habit of mind right now, right? So things like teamwork, you don't want to spend a lot of energy trying to figure out how to work with people. If we can inject that into an organization, that allows teams to get into a quote unquote flow state, which allows them to see more of the external environment. So they're not spending energy trying to figure out how to work together and all that. They're spending that energy to looking outside. Um, Similarly, you want system two thinking. You want slow, deliberate thinking, and we can slow the organization down or a team down and give them methods to do that when they need to do that based off the context. Hey, we need to slow down and do a deliberate approach, which is going to be a little bit on the lower end of the OODA loop. So bottom half of the OODA loop, which goes through decision and action internally. So run those internal simulations, but you still need to be dependent on process. So process would be how we develop intuition. Right. So I want to touch on something else. Intuition, and this goes into Wall Street. If I understand this correctly, the most important skill on Wall Street is interoceptive skills, right? That connectedness to the external environment through your senses. So how do you develop that? Well, that's where you have to go inside. You have to slow things down, be deliberate about meditation, working out, breathing, whatever it may be, right? Whatever allows you to connect to your inner self. That way you can be more attuned to these senses that are, or these sensory capabilities that we all have, right? And that's what we want with leaders as well. We want them to build that experience up. We want them to lean a little bit on their intuition to make decisions. Hey, does this feel right? Am I making the right decision? They can use that in some instances. So, Moose, you have anything to add on that?
I mean, as within, so without. A lot of the stuff that we do is to get leaders to look inward and self-reflect because they. I used to say this all the time when I would teach this to investment advisors and others that stop looking for prescriptions, right? Don't when Ponch and I show up, and oftentimes it's behind closed doors with senior leaders that don't want anybody to think that they're getting coaching or help or guidance or whatever. But don't ask us for pills. We don't have them. Don't ask us for drugs. Don't ask us for quick fixes and easy buttons. Those are prescriptions. We're trying to get them to subscribe to bigger understandings of things that apply and affect us all. In this case, one of our starting points would be understanding orientation and how it implicitly guides and controls how they sense make, how they form decisions, how they form actions, how they learn from that, which in turn goes to their ability to create and improve their capacity for free and independent action. Most consulting engagements, most advisory engagements are looking for pills. That's why a lot of times the results are short-lived. They're not enduring. When also too, when you subscribe, then you can build subscription from your teams, from your people. So when that leader, one of the things that we think that we set ourselves apart to try to do is really build that internal component that the leadership can in turn teach that to the people that they're charged with leading, who in turn are closer to the problems, who in turn can understand teamwork and intuition and build mutual trust. And when they do that, it is really, really, really clear which of their competitors are not. And then
Right.
it opens up massive vulnerabilities, and the competition angle of what Boyd's talking about becomes relentless. You become inherently ruthless because your competitors are not going to be able to answer what it is, because you're able to sense make faster, you're able to act faster, and not just with speed, but with the orientation that's matched to the actual reality as best as it could. That dissonance of what I see and what's real is closer than wider.
It's interesting too because it's almost like the same hostility that we might bring to politics. Excuse me. In the sense of what you said something really important there that goes back to Hayek, it goes back to Boyd, and that is, I take it, how you adjudicate decision making sometimes within a firm, and that is who's closest to the action. Now, it's not always. Someone can have an insight who's not as close to the action, but more likely than not, the person who's closest to the action is going to have been able to adequately orient him or herself to some relevant piece of information to be able to decide and act. And that's the thing that people don't get about why politics sucks, because politicians are the furthest away from the action. They're
So
terrible decision makers. And so that's the first thing. And then the second thing that occurs to me about this is reminds me of something that Brian Robertson said. Brian Robertson has developed holacracy, which is a radically decentralized management philosophy within a firm. And he said, I can stand up here and talk about holacracy, or you can even read the book. But at a certain point, you're going to have to embody it. You're going to have to practice it. And I heard you say basically something that mirrors what he said, which is the best players in the world can't read the FIFA manual. They have to get out on the field and kick balls. And
so
that's really the difference with this idea of embodying these practices.
So we'll both answer this. I'll go first because Ponch is going to add from a different angle, which I think will augment this. But the first part where you're saying about politicians, and to be clear of those listening, that would be our potential clients that we'd love to have. We're not here to help you make we're not here to help you make better decisions. Better decisions are a product of having an orientation that's attuned to reality. For us, orientation is everything. It's not your decisions. Your decisions are a product of your orientation. That's the other thing that differentiates what we're trying to do versus what the bad Boyd crowd or the linear crowd or the complicated crowd is trying to do. We're trying to show people that their orientation is everything. How they sense, how they form decisions, which we believe are hypotheses, and how they test those hypotheses via action, and how that loops back via learning. All of that is a product of an attuned orientation. That's ultimately what we're trying to do to get them into that state of flow, what Ponch was talking about. That's the attunement. The second thing that you brought up about, you're kind of hitting on the difference between prescriptive and subscriptive. I mean, you have to do the work. I can give you every Boyd book, every briefing, everything that you could possibly want to know about Boyd. You could put it all in an LM, and you're never going to get the results that you would want, and you're never going to get the way that Ponch and I would teach, because it, like anything else, Ponch used the term earlier, muscle memory. You have to continue to do this. You have to continue to update your cognitive operating system yourself. You have to do the learning. There's no way out of that. There's no way out of that whirl of reorientation. If you think that there is, your consulting engagement's already failed. And if you brought in a big box to come in there and spreadsheet you to death and do all that, you're going to spend a lot of money on a lot of nothing because you were focused on the wrong things. It's always coming down to orientation. That's the elevation, if you will, from getting them out of thinking that OODA and what Boyd's talking about is a decision framework, or what Mises is talking about through praxeology is some kind of a decision framework. No, it's not. It's an orientation framework. Yeah. That's the distinction.
Well, this is something that. Oh yeah. Oh, okay, please. And if you don't mind, do so with respect to the idea that when you're talking about Mises, it's almost like we orient ourselves to satisfaction, which is essentially what praxeology is talking about, right? Is that we have this really
Yeah,
organic
desired end state. My
human,
desired end state.
my desired end state, right? We want to satisfy some want or need. There's going to be an issue, what the economists call a principal agent problem,
Mhm.
right? Which is when I'm working on behalf of an organization and not myself. I'm obviously working on behalf of myself and an organization, but I'm also working on behalf of people whom I represent, or I'm being a proxy for a mission, not my personal mission, but an organizational mission.
Mhm.
Does that, Punch, as you were about to go into this, if you can riff
Yeah.
also on the potential for distortion there?
Yeah, so I'll just describe behavior. So the constraints within a system, leaders and organization policies and all that are going to drive our behaviors as leaders or team members, right? So what I want to do is take that idea of constraints within a system and go back to your FIFA analysis and talk about sports. In sports, what they do, generally most coaches are going to put cones out there and have them dribble around the cones and kind of do all that thing. That is not a great reflection of the actual environment they're going to participate in. So I'll use basketball for a moment. They'll do basketball drills. They'll do these weave drills where basketball players will push the ball around without letting it touch the ground. And that looks really cool, but you'll never do that in a game. So what you have to do, going back to the point about experiencing this, you have to put people in a we'll call it a simulation for now, or some type of shared experience where they can feel what they're actually going to be up against in their real environment in the simulated environment. So back to sports. A lot of coaches use small-sided games. They'll put it, hey, we're going to play for the next 3 minutes, 3-on-3, whatever it may be, and they just let it go, right? What you need to do in that instance is put constraints on that team. Hey, there's no going to basketball. There's no passing if you're inside the 3-point arc, right? You can't catch the ball there, but somebody has to pick it up at the low tee underneath the basket, right? Somebody has to touch it there, and it has to go back out. You can put constraints in there. You can put constraints on the defense, and what that does, it changes the way you experience the external world. So the whole idea is called perception, action, and affordance. It's a perception action loop. It's part and embedded inside of John Boyd's work. So this is how you actually realize the power of the OODA loop is if you understand how systems work, the agent interacting with the external environment, and how leaders work in this, you start to see you manipulate the external environment to create the behaviors you want. And that's where we started with is when you have this principal agent relationship, that principle, that those constraints are driving the behaviors of those that are working for them, right? So we want to find those constraints within a system that get to the outcome that we actually want. We want to win games, right? We want to win. We want to deliver value to a customer. We want to deliver this product. How do we do that? And that shifts the way you think about leadership and coaching.
I'll give you an example too, Max, that people could think about. And one of the things that Brian and I do professionally is actually sort of as he was just talking about, create a simulated environment that teams can actually go through. So there's we call it the flow learning lab, where teams learn how to interact with each other, sort of like a flight simulator. And you can take people in manufacturing or at a law firm or a basketball team or whatever, and the next thing you know, they're divided into two groups inside of a mission to Mars or a mission to Venus. And through that hands-on simulation, we can assess their behavior, because that's what Ponch just said. Systems drive behavior. That's crucial. We can assess the human behavior and see how that team can develop and the gaps that they need to do to help them manage their workloads and the various stressors that they have as their, the various complex situations that they deal with. And ultimately, by helping them develop that mutual trust and helping them develop that, develop more intuition, that team is able to be more adaptable and more resilient in the conditions that are real to whatever it is that they do.
My kids ask me what I do for work, and I say, I write, talk into a microphone, and hope people send money. Now I'm questioning my life choices, but the kids gotta eat, and we have bureaucracies to topple. Support our work at underthrow.org, and for less than $5 a month, you'll help me rouse the rabble. Wait, what's underthrow? If overthrow is violent, underthrow is peaceful yet powerful. Real change doesn't start in Washington. Casting your vote with millions is like crying a teardrop into the ocean. Instead, we build consent-based communities that make traditional power structures obsolete. Left, right, or center, it doesn't matter. What matters is creating options for opting out and opting in. We build parallel systems in which people thrive, then just leave the old systems behind. It's about choosing communities, not imposing them. So, support the show, feed my kids, read the newsletter, and discover why most subversive acts amount to building a better civilization together. Visit underthrow.org.